And so for a period of time after that murder, his name became a pejorative on Evansville playgrounds. Little boys would throw that at each other. And that the boy that I'm talking about actually was so bullied that his parents moved out of town. He was pulled out of school, and his parents moved, which was just unbelievable. So I remember telling my mother, I said, there's probably a lot of history about gay people and Evansville. And I said, I really should write a book about it. And she said, well, it'll be the only history book ever delivered in a brown paper wrapper. Um, so I started really working on this during COVID, when there wasn't much to do after work. I'd get home from work, unless you're going to Walmart, and you can't do that every day. So I sat down, I had all my notes and a whole file folder full of stuff. And so I pulled this together in 2021, and I had most of it done, except the footnotes, which I want to tell you I absolutely loathe footnotes. But you have to do them in a history book. So I called Jim McLeod at UE, who had written a book about World War II. And I said, hey, I've got this book, and I don't know what to do with it. And he said, well, I know what to do with it. So he sent me to his rep at Arcadia Publishing, and they said, oh, yes, we will publish this book. So back in Evansville, Indiana, Evansville goes back a long, long way. It's an old city. So when you research queer history, you can't just look up the words gay, because that only goes back to about the late 1930s in relation to homosexual people. That only goes back so far. And you can't really use the word homosexual, because that only goes back so far. The earliest references I could find to homosexuality directly mentioned in Evansville was maybe sometime in the 1920s, and it was talking about women, lesbians. So I thought, okay, so what you have to do is you have to look up words, you have to search words that are really ugly that we don't use anymore. Well, some people use them, I guess. But you have to look up perversion, sex perversion, sodomy, sodomite, all these really ugly words. And then when you do that, then the floodgates open, and you can find anything that you want. So Evansville really goes back to the early 1800s. But in Evansville, I think Evansville's always had kind of a strange relationship with sexuality. Now, if you go back far enough and research the first inklings that people here were aware of homosexuality, and so I'm sure everyone in here, when I talk to college classes, some college classes, I ask the kids if they know who Oscar Wilde was. About a third of them do, if they took some English or whatever, but most of them don't know who Oscar Wilde was. So the trial of Oscar Wilde, he was lovers with Lord Alfred Douglas, the nephew of Queen Victoria. And Alfred Douglas's father was the Marquis of Queensberry, kind of a jerk. But the Marquis belonged to the same men's club that Oscar Wilde did. And he was leaving notes on the door of the club saying that, Oscar was a sodomite, that he was corrupting his son, and just all kinds of vitriol against Oscar. So Oscar sued him for slander. And of course, when you sue somebody for slander, you have to show that they're lying. So on the witness stand, Oscar Wilde, testified that indeed he was lovers with Lord Alfred Douglas. And so he was actually sent to prison. The slander charge was dropped, and he was sent to prison, and he died in 1900. But during this trial, the Evansville newspapers went crazy. They published lots and lots and lots of scathing details about Oscar and his loathsome partner in debauchery, Alfred Taylor. The reason why this is important in the story in Evansville is because the newspapers all came to the same conclusion that anyone who lives as Oscar did really should just go ahead and commit suicide. There was a phrase that the Courier used, seek the solace that Brutus sought, which is falling on your sword, in the terms of Shakespeare. So, but Evansville, at the same time this was going on, that they were pillorying Oscar Wilde for being gay. Evansville had a municipally legally protected brothel district This is High Street, which no longer exists. Part of the only part of High Street that still exists is right here, and that is the parking lot of the Score Strip Club. This is Fulton Avenue down here. It's just this little thing. But High Street ran about 3 blocks between First Street and Second Street downtown. Some of these things, most of these things are all gone now. Bally's is over here. There's the river. There's Riverside, the boulevard right there. So all of these are gone. This was all demolished. This is Second Street. Used to come off Ohio, and Second Street curves around and goes into the business district. But right here, there were in 1900 there were no fewer than 26 operating brothels that the city government allowed to operate, and it operated until World War II, when the military forced the city to shut it down because a lot of their soldiers were coming down with venereal diseases, and they picked them up here in this High Street red light district. So Mayor Dress shut it down for the duration of the war, and then it reopened. All the women came back and reopened the brothels, but it was all torn down in urban renewal. I guess, what is it, One Main? I used to work there for 30 years, but American General's over here, Bally's is over here, but all of this is long gone. But I think Evansville had sort of a bifurcated existential crisis when it came to sexuality, because it condemned homosexuality, and polite society looked down its nose at High Street. But from what I've read, High Street is one of the busiest, would rival Green River Road now. So if you move into the period around World War I, which I think is really interesting when you think about what happened with public libraries and Drag Queen Story Hour a few years ago. I mean, Evansville just really lost its shit with that. But what's funny is that, and there's all these movements afoot to outlaw drag. It's crazy. But in Evansville, in 1916, Julian Elting was one of the most famous female impersonators in the country. And Julian Elting came here in a play where he was performing the entire play in drag, a play called Cousin Lucy, and the Evansville newspapers just lauded his performance and said what a brilliant actor he is. And I think, though, from what I can understand in Julian Elting's shows that he did, at the end of the play, he would come out of drag and be Julian, similar to maybe Milton Berle on his TV show, or who was the comic that did Geraldine? He's passed. Philip Wilson, Geraldine. So if it's drag for a purpose, and then you come out at the end and show you're a man, like, I guess it's okay. But in 1881, Indiana passed its stringent law about sex. Basically, sex that could not result in procreation was illegal, and especially sex between the same sex, men specifically. Sodomy. Doing research for the book, I was fascinated. I always loved like Perry Mason and shows like that. I found like 74 cases in Vanderburgh County where men were arrested, and one woman in the very first one I can find, 1922, was a guy named Benny Young who owned a taxi service, and there was a raid at a hotel, and there were 5 men and 1 woman, all doing whatever they wanted. I mean, they were having a really good time, and the police raided it. And Benny Young and Pearl Money was the woman's name. She was 20 years old, and that would be a great drag. But they arrested all of them, and Benny Young appealed the decision by Evansville's court that he was guilty of sodomy, and George Heilman, his brother was actually a mayor at one time, but George Heilman, who was the prosecutor, said that the Indiana State Supreme Court affirmed the decision, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear it, an appeal. So it stood. He was in 1927 is when his sentence was actually carried out. I think he served 2 or 3 years for that. But the interesting thing here is Heilman said that Vanderburgh County established stare decisis in such prosecution of sodomy cases that every other place in America that decided a sodomy case really referred back to the Benny M decision. So it's interesting. Mm-hmm. That's from 1927. So as you move into the 30s, the book kind of goes into, and I'm just kind of telling you stuff that's in the book, this isn't like an educational lecture, but so in the 30s, the newspaper, and that's where people got their news, on the maybe the radio, but mostly you read your newspapers every day when you wanted to find information out. So beginning in 1937, there was Dr. George Crane from Northwestern University. He was a psychologist, and he started writing a daily column in the national newspapers, of which the Courier was a subscriber. And so they would run this, and it was advice on his cases that he actually had as a psychologist. But he was the first one to really start mentioning homosexuality in a public newspaper in Evansville. And his column once in a while would deal mostly with lesbians, though. There were men that would write that say, I can't understand why my wife only wants to be with her girlfriends. And, I can't understand why she doesn't want to have marital relations with me. She's over with girlfriends all the time. Well, she's a lesbian. But he sort of told people that homosexuality was a phase. And that boys go through a phase where they only want to be around boys, and girls go through a phase when they only want to be around girls, and then puberty hits, and the two separate. But it said there are some people that are held behind after that, and they're victims of failure to progress. They're for whatever reason. And there were guys would write him and say, I don't want to be homosexual. And his answer was, well, if you send me 75 cents in a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll send you a book on how to cure it. So I think people started getting the idea that this was a phase, that this was maybe a psychological thing, because there were people that would write letters to the paper. The letters to the editor in Evansville are just amazing, just incredible. Some people were complaining that he was even mentioning it all, and some people were writing letters to the editor saying, what a big help this is, because we're trying to cure our kid and all that. So in the 50s, then some of the upper echelon psychological agents, institutions out there were saying that hey, this shouldn't be a crime. Homosexuality shouldn't be a crime. It's criminal everywhere, but it's a mental condition. It's a psychological condition. That it shouldn't be criminal. That we need to decriminalize that. And finally, I think in 72 or 73, it was taken off the list of mental issues. So Evansville was fascinated with as you move into the 50s. McCarthy, and that's another thing college students aren't aware of. They're not aware of Joseph McCarthy. But during the McCarthy era, in addition to communists, McCarthy was looking for homosexuals in government. And in 1950, the Evansville Press celebrated the fact that 91 homosexuals were kicked out of the State Department. But the press said that really just firing these people is not there may be some jobs which can be handled satisfactorily by men and women of abnormal sex habits, but not in the diplomatic service or any other agency entrusted with our nation's security. That is true not alone because of the emotional instability of such people, but also because their practices make them such easy targets for blackmail by the agents of foreign governments. So what they said, the press said, that not only should they be fired, but the people who hired them should be fired. And basically in 1901, they said, we need to get rid of Harry Truman because he's the one that's responsible for all this. And this is, you might remember Bill Moyers was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary for a long time. This is Walter Jenkins. And Walter Jenkins, if you remember when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson became president, and there was no vice president until Hubert Humphrey was sworn in 1965 because they didn't have that law yet. So Walter Jenkins was Johnson's chief of staff, his legislative aide, and as Johnson moved up through the Senate, Jenkins became more and more powerful. And when Johnson went to the White House, Walter Jenkins really was the de facto VP of the country. He flew to France and England. He did foreign policy for Johnson until he got arrested at the YMCA for having sex with another man. And then Walter Jenkins was OUT. So in Evansville, and into the 60s, the book details a lot more about the history. In order for a minority culture to have any sort of progress, to progress in themselves, there has to be some sort of organized life. You know, African Americans, when they moved to Evansville in mass in the 1860s and 70s, their culture revolved around churches. The organized Black life began to organize around churches, and then later the Black schools. And so gay and lesbian people really had no organized life because it was illegal to be gay in Indiana. It was illegal. So you had to be really, really cautious. You could be fired from your job. You could be, ostracized from your family if they found out what was going on. So there were some early efforts at having organized gay life in Evansville, but finally, in 1968, the very first real official gay bar opened at Fulton and Division. I could never find a photograph of the building. This would be Division Street here, and this is Fulton Avenue right here. It's just an empty lot now, but it was built as Ward's Steakhouse, and then later, two guys bought it who were really such good pals that they renamed it the Pals Steakhouse. It was owned, at one time was owned by Pete Mosby. And when Pete Mosby bought it from these two guys, Pete Mosby then, if you're old enough to remember Pete's Supper Club, he built Pete's Supper Club a little further down Division, and he sold Pals to a straight couple, Joe and Joanne Klumper, who had friends who were female impersonators. And so they wanted to do something to help their queer friends, and so they bought this place and opened it up as a gay bar. And it operated as a gay club from 68 to about 1974, when it closed. That whole area was really starting to go downhill. It was torn down when they built the Lloyd Expressway. So I divided the book up, the story I wanted to tell, into several sections. The struggle for organized gay life, the awareness, the beginnings of the awareness of homosexuality in Evansville and the surrounding area, and then the search for and lack of justice where gay people were concerned. And in the 60s, beginning in 1954, during the 60s, there were a series of murders, including my old friend Rudy Ziemer. Of course, he died when I was 4. I didn't really know him, but he's always been in the back of my mind, talking to me. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? But I kept thinking that he wanted this story told. So this series of murders illustrated, I think, Evansville's reaction to having homosexuality brought to its attention. I think if it had never been brought to their attention, maybe things would have been different. But so in 1954, this is Andrew Reagan. He was 27, a trucking executive. I did a public access records request. It's still an unsolved murder, but he disappeared. He was missing for a couple weeks. His body was found near Henderson on Highway 60, beaten to death with a tire iron. His head was beaten in so badly that no one could recognize him. The only way they identified him, he had a class ring. He was from Glasgow, Kentucky. His father had bought him his class ring when he graduated, and the jeweler had made a mistake and had put the father's initials inside the band of the ring. And so the only way they could identify his body was by that class ring, because it still had the dad's initials in it, so they knew who he was. But he disappeared. He'd been at the McCurdy. There was a bar there called the Coral Room, which homosexuals frequented the Coral Room late at night. He disappeared, and they couldn't find him. 6 years after the murder, they found his car in the bottom of a river in Michigan. And so I started thinking, well, I knew that the Kentucky State Police had investigated the killing. And when they went into, he lived at the Audubon, which is downtown. He lived at the Audubon, and they found a box that had letters in it. And the newspapers only reported that these letters were from men all around the country. And so I knew that if you remember the old physique magazines they used to have in the 50s, Muscle and Physique and all those, I never gave them. But in the back, they would have advertisements for pen pal clubs, communicate via pen pal. And so I knew that that's how a lot of gay people communicated under the radar. So I filed a public access records request with the state police in Michigan and Kentucky, and Michigan responded that it was too old, that they didn't have anything. But Kentucky sent me a giant file of stuff. And thank God, because it really opened the doors for me to understand Andrew Reagan. There were letters in this flash drive that were from he had a boyfriend for several years that he'd met in Bloomington, and the guy had broken up with him. He was still living in Bloomington. They'd moved to Michigan. Andrew Reagan was still in Evansville. And so his boyfriend, they went to Michigan because that's where the guy lived. That's where they found the car, right? So they interviewed him, and he said, yeah, he said that he'd broken up with Andy about 3 months before the murder. He said he'd heard of the murder, but he said he was really upset about it. But Andrew, they never did find out who killed him, and the state police knew he was homosexual from the minute they opened that apartment up. But they stopped really looking, I think, for his killer because I think it didn't matter to them anymore. They had a lot of detective notes and things, but they said, well, it was probably someone he picked up late at night, and they could never trace it. So then in 1960, at the YMCA downtown, there was a guy named Jack Burdett. That goes back in those days, men rented rooms that they could sleep in at the YMCA upstairs. There were all these sleeping rooms, and Jack Burdett had a room up there. And on November 3rd, 1960, he invited a young man that was staying across the hall, James Holcomb, over for. He said he had some whiskey, and so they drank some whiskey, and apparently they engaged in some sexual activity. But then the next thing we know is a guy working across the street at Indiana Bell, the third shift. His call board was just right there. His window faced the Y. This guy heard breaking glass, and he looked down. There was still a street light right there. That's the entrance there on Vine. And there was a guy laying here in the sidewalk, bloody and covered with glass. And so they thought it was a suicide. But this Holcomb said, well, yeah, we did have sex, but I wanted to get out of the room, and this guy was pursuing me, and I couldn't get out of the room, so I had to throw him out the window to get out of the room. This is Howard Sandusky, who was a very powerful local attorney, big Republican, surprise. And so he created this self-defense argument for Holcomb, and the jury acquitted him. They completely overlooked the fact that he'd stuffed 2 pieces of a shirt down Burdett's throat so that he couldn't cry out, and then pushed him out the window to certain death. I mean, 4 stories up. So in 1963, then, our friend Rudy Ziemer was out drinking one night. He was an alcoholic, and he was 56. He was an alcoholic, and he'd been arrested several times under the old sodomy laws. And he stopped on March the 12th, 63, stopped in at the old Kentucky barbecue, and he got into a verbal altercation with some paratroopers who were on leave from Fort Campbell that night. And so one thing led to another, and if you want to read the whole story, you got to buy the book. But they got him in a car. There was a car behind him that had 2 girls in it, and one of the girls provided almost all of the testimony against him because there were 2 girls in the car. But Patrick Peary, this guy, he was smart enough to marry the other girl so that she couldn't testify as to what was going on. But basically, they strangled him with his necktie. They beat him unmercifully, apparently, in the car. And this fella, Charles Thompson, the tall one in the middle, he actually signed a confession when they were brought to Evansville and said, yes, we had to kill him because he was making unnatural advances to us. And they took his car down and pushed it into the floodwater. That Ohio was at flood stage. This is Weinbach Avenue, the levees here. So they pushed away the barricades and took his car and pushed it 4 feet into the floodwater. He was still alive, they said, he was because the coroner said he drowned. His lungs were full of river water. So a year and a half went by. He married the other girl, Melvina Schutt, that was in the car. He's still alive. I mailed him a letter that he never did answer. I think he's like 84 now, something like that. But he never did. He never answered me. So they were acquitted. The defense attorney, Jim Locke Sr. and Howard Sandusky both said that the person who was at fault was Rudy Zimmer for being an old homosexual and preying on these three upstanding young GIs that were serving their country. And basically he got what he deserved, which was death, and the jury agreed and acquitted all three. So there they are, that happy picture, the day of their acquittal. And there's Melvina with her new baby, celebrating with her husband. So actually, I think all but Patrick, I think, has died. But anyway, it shows you that even with a solid trail of evidence and all the proof that you need and a confession, you're still going to get away with it because the guy was clear. So 3 years later, almost to the day, Kenneth Sanders owned an auction barn. He was an auctioneer and an antique collector and dealer, and he picked up off the street, apparently. There's a little 4-unit apartment building on Southeast First Street in the middle of the Victorian houses on the street. It said First and Chandler. It kind of looks sort of out of place, I think. It was built during the war. But anyway, Kenneth Sanders lived in this apartment, 703B up here, and he picked Stutzman up off the street and brought him back to the apartment, and during the night, Stutzman beat Kenneth Sanders to death with an old flat iron that women used to use before, electricity. Crushed his skull, crushed his face in. So this guy was a friend, and I found out later he's still alive. This guy, this was his 19th birthday. He was a friend of Sanders, and he was coming up to see Sanders, and he actually ran into this guy coming out of the apartment, and he gave this guy a lift somewhere. But he said something just really bothered him about this guy coming out of the apartment. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, right? So he flagged down a policeman. They went up and found Ken's body. The reason why this case is important is because in October, when the case was moved to Pike County, and the local prosecutor here was going to prosecute the case up there. But at the last minute, Stutzman agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter. The prosecutor, James Kiley, said that manslaughter carries a sentence of 2 to 10 years at the state farm, and I think he did 2 years. But Kiley said that it would be impossible to get a guilty verdict of capital murder where there's homosexuality in the charge. That it was impossible to get a capital murder verdict here. That it was just not possible. So he had to plead guilty to manslaughter so that he could actually have a conviction and do a little bit of time for this horrendous killing. But that's important because it shows you the value of LGBTQ lives here. If the auctioneer had been a woman, Stutzman would have gotten life in prison or death. He would have gotten the death penalty. But because it was another man, because he made moves on him, he could plead guilty just to manslaughter. So in the 60s, if you know anything about Hollywood, you know that during the late 1930s, there was a production code which wiped out all mentions of homosexuality in movies. You had to really be on the right wavelength to find homosexuality in films. I mean, you could find it, but there's a movie called Dracula's Daughter that came out in, I think, 1935, where the advertisement said, "Oh, ladies of London, guard your daughters from Dracula's daughter." She only bit women, right? So, it's like, on the right wavelength, okay, so she's a lesbian. But as the movies from Europe started to infiltrate American cinema, that production code started to crumble a little bit. And I thought, okay, how do I translate this phenomenon, this bringing of homosexuality into film, to Evansville? Well, I went back and started reading movie reviews that Gene Heinrich and the other movie reviewers did in Evansville of these films that actually they reviewed. And the first one that I could find was a movie from 1959 called Suddenly Last Summer with Liz Taylor, Katharine Hepburn, poor old Monty Clift, Liz Taylor. Has anybody not seen Suddenly Last Summer? Well, Liz Taylor, this is a film that homosexuality in this film gives you representation without identity. She has witnessed the murder of her cousin, who was a wealthy New Orleans young man. He had her travel with him to Europe, where he preyed on all of these boys at this seaside Spanish town where they were on vacation. And she's lost her memory because she's blocked out his murder. But all these boys that he's apparently molested, they gang up on him in a Roman ruin and kill him. And they eat him. I mean, it's horrific, but you never see his face. You only see him from behind. So you have this gay character that's symbolized. You know he's gay, but he has no voice. He has no face. He's just this guy in a white suit that these brown boys are chasing up a hill. And so eventually she remembers what happened, and poor old Catherine Hepburn loses her mind. But so Jean Heinrich, when she reviewed this film, you know, she talks about Tennessee Williams is the one who wrote the story, and she's like, oh my God, this movie is, you know, for adults only. If you like cannibalism, homosexuality, incest, if you like these horrible things, then this is the movie for you. Well, my mother said everybody in town went to see it. But that was her reaction to this film. So then a few years later, the film The Children's Hour came to Evansville. And The Children's Hour was a story of two women who operate a boarding school for girls. There's a scandal, and apparently one of the girls has lied and said that she saw Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine engaged in lesbian sex. Lillian Hellman wrote the book way back in the 1930s, I think. But so this film was the first one to actually present this story that has lesbianism in it. But so what Hollywood did, beginning with this film, really, is that Shirley MacLaine, at the end of the movie, realizes that she's a lesbian and that she's at fault for this whole problem, and so she hangs herself. And so that became the norm in Hollywood films where there was homosexuality. In Walk on the Wild Side, Capucine is lovers with Barbara Stanwyck, poor thing. And so she ends up getting killed. There's a whole series of films, Advising Consent. There's a young senator who's being blackmailed. Don Murray plays him. And so when the affair he had with another man during the war is about to be made public, he kills himself. So in all these movies, the gay character has to die at the end. But the reviews that Jean Heinrich and Bill Gumberts, who was the reviewer for the press, they started this. She called this film shocking but touching in a human way, and you can appreciate the humanity and Shirley MacLaine's character. And Don Murray, she feels sorry for Don Murray that and so the reviews that they're doing on these plays start to modify during the mid to late 60s, until you get to The Boys in the Band, Mark Crowley's very successful play made into a film and came here in 1970. And Jean Heinrich lauds the film. She is celebrating it. She's like, it's for adults only, but it's touching and it's got biting humor in it. It's well done cinematically. And Bill Gumberts does the same thing. He calls it top-notch entertainment. It's about a birthday party, 6 gay men and 1 straight man, and how these 6 gay men eviscerate each other at this birthday party. I mean, it's a great film. Honestly, it is. The later gay liberation movement pilloried the film, said it was like having Daniel and Gone with the Wind, that it should be swept under the rug. But I have a copy of the original. HBO did one a couple years ago. But anyway, so that's how the reviewers started to modify their reaction. Now, people who wrote letters to the editor when the Children's Hour and when Advising Consent got here, letter writers were like really mad that the local theaters were showing these films. They said, we want the days back when everybody could go see every film. You didn't have to have reviewers to tell you where to go. This was before the rating system. There was no GRX or whatever. But anyway, so that's how I looked at it in the book. And so in 1977, that 1880 law was repealed. And so gay bars kind of started springing up around Indiana. This is the first one that I went to, the Swinging Door. That's a picture of me when I had long curly hair, giving a kiss to my friend Lori Reynolds, who's my upstairs neighbor, at the swinging door. I wasn't 21 when I started to go there, but we'll talk about that some other time. Yeah, because there's the New Year's Eve party, New Year's Eve bring in 1980 with the band. I did. And then someplace else, I believe, is now the longest existing alternative bar in Indiana. And it has been since Halloween 1992, when Ellen Campbell changed it from a regular bar to an alternative bar. So in 81, there was a murder of a lesbian. Laura Lubehusen was murdered. She's a beautiful little blonde girl, and her girlfriend, she was a girlfriend on a house on East Tennessee Street. House is gone. Laura Lubehusen, her girlfriend, her partner, testified at the murder trial of Thomas Shiro because the defense was saying Shiro killed her after they had consensual sex, but her lover said, no, that's not possible. It had to be a rape because Laura was a lesbian and she was not having sex with any man, let alone this piece of trash. And so he was actually convicted. It's the first time anyone murdered a homosexual person in Vanderbilt County and was convicted of capital murder. He just got out, I understand. So this in 1982, all of a sudden in 1982, there was this explosion of gay films. The first one that I remember coming here was a movie called Making Love with Michael Onke and Harry Hamlin. A bunch of us went to see it at the opening, and I think there were 7 or 8 of us in the back row, and the theater was packed. But it came with this warning label, it was in the newspaper, what it was about, and then at the beginning of the film, there's this disclaimer that says, this film deals honestly with homosexuality. If this offends you, you need to leave. And so all these people stay, but about 20 minutes into the film, there's a moment where Michael Onke's character and Harry Hamlin kiss. Well, kids, that theater erupted. All these people jumped up, yelling, screaming, guys grabbing their girlfriends and their wives, going up the aisles, cussing this film. Oh, this is horrible, horrible. And my friends and I were sitting back there just going, oh, these stupid people. So, but there was, that year came Personal Best. There was Partners with Ryan O'Neal. There was just a whole slew of gay-themed films in 1982 that came here. I went to see every one of them. So in May of 81, Joycelyn Winnicke wrote this great article about gay Evansville. It was the first time that anybody had ever dealt with it in a positive way. And she wanted people to know. She interviewed, I think, 10 people that they had let their names be used. Nobody wanted their name used because they'd lose their job. And one woman was married and one guy was married. And so they wanted to be on the QT. And so I remember that Sunday that came out, all of my friends, we all brought our Sunday papers. Darrell had brunch out at the old Ramada Inn by the pool out on 41. We all brought our Sunday papers because I knew who 2 of them were, and somebody knew who another one was, and so we were all comparing notes on who they were. But anyway, it was a great article, but the sad irony of that is right about a month later, AIDS hit on the coasts in June of 1981. But in Evansville, there was a lot of trouble going on. There were beatings, there were threats, people were chasing gay people with baseball bats and tire irons, and there was an attack on somebody outside of the swinging door, and the Tri-State Alliance, Yvonne Mabry, Yvonne Morin now, she and some other people founded this Tri-State Alliance to try and combat this threat of violence and the lack of help from the police department and from official people to try and quell this madness that was going on around here. It was just terrible. So there was another killing in '84. Charles Keaton was an Episcopal priest who was found murdered by the old tennis courts that used to be there at Sunset Park. And his killer, Patrick Collins, was convicted of capital murder as well and sentenced to life in prison. So you know that the important thing about the Lubehusen murder and Keaton's murder is that when the earlier killings of Burdett and Zemer and Ken Sanders, the defense attorneys would ask prospective jurors, have you ever been approached by a homosexual? Have you heard that this man, Zemer, was arrested on sodomy charges several times? What would you do if someone was preying on your son or daughter that was like, and so the prosecutors didn't question this line of bullshit that these defense attorneys were doing with these prospective jurors. So these cases, especially Lubehusen and Charles Harry Keaton, were different in that the prosecutor would ask the prospective juror, do you feel murdering a homosexual person carries the same weight as the murder of a heterosexual person? And in all these cases, every prospective juror that they interviewed said yes, that it was the same weight. So that's how you know that society around here has shifted, is in that seeking of justice for the taking of a gay life. There were others here that are in the book. So AIDS, when AIDS hit here, it was slow to get here. We knew that it was on the coast. We knew that there was, they call it a gay cancer. They called it gay-related immune disorder, GRID, for a couple of years. And I think there was a whole population in the Midwest that only thought it affected gay people, gay men. I think there were people that really felt that way. A lot of ministers said, oh, well, this is their reward for their sinful lifestyle, not realizing, of course, that it was a disease like any other that could be spread to all people. So the first AIDS case that happened here was in about 85. The first death was in 86. And so once people started, and there were a lot of sons of very wealthy families that were my age that I knew were coming home to die. Or they were dying where they had settled. One of the things when I was 22, graduated from college, you had two choices. You either make it here if you had enough connections to get a good job, or you left town. You went to New York, you went to LA, you went to Nashville, you went to Houston, you went all different cities where you could make more money. And a lot of these guys were dying, and some came home to die, some died where they were. I kind of profiled some of the people who died, but the AIDS Resource Group, ARG, was formed in 87 because these guys that were getting sick, it was a death sentence because you died within about 24 months. So you were diagnosed, and then 24 months later you would be dead. And you would go from being a healthy, robust, healthy person until you were, a lot of the guys looked like skeletons at the time that they died. And so the AIDS Resource Group was started to try and mobilize resources to keep these people as comfortable as possible, to sign them up for SSI. I mean, these are guys that wouldn't have applied for Social Security for 35 more years. And so they tried to get SSI and Medicaid and to get them the new drugs that were coming out that sometimes were worse than the disease. But so I profiled some of the people, but I joined ARG's board in '93, and it was really hard to raise money. But what started happening was this is Ann Tornado, Ann Wright. She was part of the Wright family, the Wright Motors. Her brother Andy lived in Atlanta. He worked for CNN. He won an Emmy, for God's sake. And Sam Ryan was the son of George and Martha Ryan, a very wealthy couple, had 5 kids. Sam died, he was 33 when he died. And so the Ryans wanted to help. Ann joined our board. And so John Streetman, who's a very good friend of everybody in town, knew John. John was also a songwriter. He'd written a whole book of music. And so the Ryans, in memory of their son, underwrote a compact disc album of a lot of John's music and paid for it. So we sold those CDs. We raised something like $15,000 from the sale of John's CD. It was a miracle. We couldn't believe it. Because John told us he was going to do a premiere party when he got the CDs in. And so we set up this table at the old gallery. It's not there anymore, the old gallery at the museum. We were going to sell these CDs. And Randy Dennison, who was the board, the executive director, he said, I don't think, do you think anybody's going to come? It was $50 a person to come to this party. And so we were sitting there waiting, and John knew that because he got the musicians to come from New York and Cary Gray and Bill McKinley and Tim Ewing all came. Ewing was on Broadway, but he flew in and we had this party. I mean, that room was packed with people. People my parents knew. Carol and Lloyd, everybody was there. And we raised a ton of money off of that. See, we owed John way more than we could ever begin to pay. And so the AIDS Walk started in '93. April Mitchell, her brother, was dead, and so she wanted to do something. And so she created the AIDS Walk here. And the second, that was in '93. It was real small. It was at USI. The next year, we had moved the ARG's offices to the old courthouse. So we did this little health fair on the lawn. And again, Randy was like, I hope people show up for this. And the whole downtown was full. I mean, people were coming from everywhere. They had fraternities, sororities. There were high school groups that had worked all year to raise money for the AIDS Walk. And again, that AIDS Walk in '94 raised 1/10 of our whole budget. So I think that, in my opinion, and all of this stuff is what I see as important in the timeline of Evansville's awareness of homosexuality and organized gay life, how Evansville reacted, what people thought, what people were saying, and how things happened. But in my opinion, the most important thing regarding homosexuality and gay people came from Judge Richard Young in 2014, because federal judge, he struck down Indiana's same-sex marriage ban that the legislature had put in place. And he basically set the stage for Obergefell at the Supreme Court in 2015 that legalized same-sex marriage across the United States. And
what was the name of that case?
Obergefell?
No, this case.
Oh, no, it was just a challenge. The ACLU had challenged it. And he struck it down. He struck it down. And so as a result of that, I've been married for 7 years. I can't get him to do laundry, but that's okay. We have 2 French bulldogs, and I came home. He's a lot younger. He's like 30 years younger than I am. And I came home one day, and he was eating this cookie. And I said, he goes, "These are pretty good." I said, "Those are for the dog." So he doesn't always think ahead. But anyway, I think that's the pinnacle of what Evansville has contributed then to the LGBTQ history of the United States. The rest of it is pretty parochial in terms of Evansville. But I think our contribution to LGBTQ nationally is richer and young. And so that is the end of my story here. I'd be happy. Well, I have one more. We in 2018, a young man named Emil Lamar came to me and he said, we need to have a pride parade. And I'm like, yeah, okay, let's do it. So we had to figure out what city laws were, what we needed to do to have one. And so we started River City Pride. Emil was the founder. And the first board, 2018, 2019, I served on their board. But all these young people, they don't need this old man butting in all the time. So I'm a board member emeritus now. But we had the very first Pride Parade in 2018. And then COVID in June 2019, COVID after 2020, 2021 sort of put the kibosh on it, but it came back in 2022. And this year, the Pride Parade was huge. I mean, even with rain, it was huge. And then there were probably 4,000 people at the event in the evening to see a show. And there were all kinds of vendor booths. And I mean, it was the list of, I'm still on their chat group, and they're doing their list of thank yous for the sponsors. I'm telling you, the list of places that donated money, had floats in the parade, and all that. I mean, it's phenomenal. I'm just really glad that I lived long enough, because if you'd asked me, I remember my husband and I were standing there watching the parade, and actually I was in Grand Marshal in 2019. And I remember I told him, I said, if you'd told me 40 years ago that we were going to have this event in Evansville, Indiana, I would have marched you out to the state hospital and had your head examined, because there is no way that that's going to happen. But it did happen, and so I'm really grateful that I lived long enough to see it. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'll be happy to sell you a book. I think I have 5 copies left, maybe. I have 5 copies if there's anybody that has any questions.
You posted that, and this was fascinating. I'm always just in awe of your knowledge of Evansville history, people's names, who knew who wore what outfit.
When I can remember,
What?
when I can remember the names.
Well, yeah, I think, anyway, you posted recently something about now that you're retired, I'm paraphrasing, now that you're retired, you can say what you want to say.
You're damn right.
Yeah, so I just want to.
Call the mayor.
And
I don't care.
everybody said, bring it on, so what is your next?
Well, I am going to co-host a fundraiser for Eric Hurt for Congress. Democrat. I worked for a Republican mayor, and for years I was a young Republican until I realized there was no such thing. And then, the Republican Party in Vanderbilt County 2 generations ago was really the progressive party. The Democrat Party was mainly a family business in Evansville, Vanderbilt County. There were brothers and sisters and cousins and all of Democrat office holders that had all the jobs. And it was the Republican Party of Russ Lloyd Sr., who was my first boss, and Dave Kaler and Jim Swander and those guys. They were unconcerned whether someone was gay or not. Dave Kaler didn't care. Jim Swander, they didn't care. They wanted everybody's support, and they wanted to do Swander Ice Rink, for example. Jim Swander, he was a great. I love campaigning for him. But over time, the Republican Party changed, and it absolutely bears no resemblance to the Republican Party that I grew up in. So I really stopped being a Republican a long time ago. I voted for Reagan the first time in '80, but I did not vote for him in '84. And I think the last Republican I voted for president was George H.W. Bush in '88, because I just thought Dukakis was a nut. But I think he's the last Republican I ever voted for president. But you can't, if you work for a Republican mayor, you can't really say what you think. And if you post something on social media, the deputy mayor will call you and say, hey, you need to take that down. You need to take that down. And you can't say, you can't post that on there. And so I always called Steve the internet police. He was the internet police. So sometimes I'd post something just to see how long it took him to see it and tell me to take it down. But so yeah, I'm not worried about anything anymore. Any other questions?
What's your next project, Kelly?
Well, I am finishing up a book called The Hidden History of Evansville Politics. And it's a deep dive in how Evansville politicians used Black votes and how they manipulated African Americans to attain power. And for years, white politicians, it was another bifurcated thing. How Evansville thought white politicians would they would pay Black people to vote for them, or they would pay Black people not to vote for them. They would promise things like better housing, they'd promise things like better jobs, and then never deliver those things. And then consequently, those same politicians in front of white audiences would blame Black people for the vice in town and the crime. Remember that high street that I showed you, the brothel area? Some of those houses were operated by African American women. And then on Lincoln Avenue, there were taverns and bars and things. Lincoln Avenue was our Black Wall Street. There were Black dentists, doctors, and stores, grocery stores, but there were also taverns and places where there was gambling and places where there was prostitution. And so it's a look at Evansville between, 1870 was the first election that Black men could vote. And instantly, the local Republican Party institutionalized those Black voters because they were the party of Lincoln. People forget that Blacks generally voted for the Republican Party until FDR came in, because it was the party of Abraham Lincoln. But the Republicans would promise things and seldom ever deliver anything. So it looks at city elections between 1870 and 1930. There was There was the phenomenon of bossism, and so it explores the different bosses that rule the black votes. Fred Ossenberg, Ben Bartlett, those are names you probably haven't heard of, but they were important men, and they controlled blocks of votes that could swing an election. You know, there were about, by 1913, 1917, there were about 2,000 black votes, and they were all corralled basically in the old Baptist town neighborhood, which was the 7th Ward. Now it's the 4th Ward, but that old 7th Ward. And whoever controlled that 7th Ward could swing an election from one side to the other. And in 1913, the black vote swung the election to Ben Bosse. Ben Bosse only won that election by a hair, and it was the black votes. That's why people who say that Ben Bosse was a Klansman, that's not true. Ben Bosse was not a member of the Klan. Whether or not Ben Bosse believed some of the things that the Klan talked about, but there is no proof that he was ever a card-carrying member of the Klan. And one reason why I know that is because the guy that organized the Klan here, Joe Huffington, said that Bosse was too close to black voters, that they'd never get him on board because he was too close to black voters. But one thing I will tell you is that the Klan ruled Evansville politics for about 5 years in the 1920s. They ruled everything in Indiana for a period of time. But in 1925, there was an election, and Ernest Tidrington was the black political boss at the time, black man. He was the boss of the black vote. He was actually assassinated in 1930, which kind of ended that whole period of bossism when he got killed. But Tidrington went to Herbert Mayles, who was the Republican candidate for mayor, and said, we need a new black high school, because Frederick Douglass was, where Channel 44 Studios is on 2nd Street? Well, that's Clark. It's closed now. It's like a field. But Clark said the black high school is right there. And it was falling down, and Tidrington went to Herbert Mayles, and Herbert Mayles said, if you will deliver the 7th Ward to me, I will build a new black high school. And I will name it after you. I'll name it Tidrington High. And you know where the African American Museum is? There's a little pork chop in the road where the Garvin goes this way, but there's a little thing right there that was part of Canal Street that goes right in front of it. Mayles renamed that street Tidrington Avenue and told Ernest Tidrington that it would lead right to the front door of Tidrington High School. And so Herbert Mayles was a member of the Klan. He was a card-carrying official member of Clavern No. 1 here in Evansville. So in 1925, the black vote brought a Klansman into the mayor's office because of that promise to build that high school. But once it started to be built, the school board decided to name it Lincoln. And Tidrington had a fit. And so Tidrington then rebelled against the Republicans in that next 1929 election, and flipped and went to support Frank Greasy, the Democrat, against the Republicans, because he was so mad that they didn't name that school after him. But it's a really interesting story about how politicians used the black vote, blamed black people for all the problems that Evansville had. They were just horrific. The images that I've assembled for the book, of cartoons the newspapers did, the 1903 attempted lynching downtown, just amazing stuff that white Evansville did. So that's.
It's interesting that Lincoln was built on Lincoln, which you said was the Wall Street back then.
Well, it was the Black Wall Street. I mean, if you think of colloquially, if you think of where black businesses were, they were on that stretch of Lincoln. Actually, that land that the school was built on was owned by the Orr family, the the Orrs owned that, and in the will, Mr. Orr's will, he wanted that land to be used for a school. And so it turned out that the school board decided to build the segregated black high school there. And boy, the neighbors, because the blacks couldn't buy homes everywhere. there were deed restrictions in all the neighborhoods all around there. The house I grew up in had a deed restriction on it. Couldn't be sold to a black. And those were legal until 1948. But when the school board announced it was going to build that high school there, man, all the people that lived just a block east, a block south, a block north, they organized themselves to fight that school. And one of their champions was a woman named Albion Fellows Bacon, who was head of the planning commission. And Albion Fellows Bacon, boy, I got yelled at a program I did, a talk I gave one time, that Albion Fellows Bacon, she said, and it was in the news right there, she said that it was a terrible mistake to turn Lincoln Avenue over to black people because the damage to property values east of there, which is the new Lincolnshire and all the homes that were being built, it was the avenue of approach to Evansville College, to the new Catholic high school that was built in 1924, that turning that section of Lincoln Avenue over to white people was a terrible mistake and would have long-term negative consequences to property values and economic development east of there. But the school board said, no, we're building the school, and it became Lincoln, of course. Half was high school and half was elementary school. There had been a black elementary. Evansville had two separate school systems. Had black schools and white schools. There were 4 black elementary and 1 black high school. But the Governor Street School was across Governor, I think where the ARC Crisis Nursery is, right there. So they closed that when they opened Lincoln. But Lincoln was the segregated school until 1962, and that's black students had to go there. That was where you went. But when it closed, in anticipation of its closure, the school board built Harrison on the far east side, and then moved Lincoln's black students to the central downtown and Bossy. So they built Harrison so that all the white students living on the east side would have somewhere to go, and they built the new central so that the white students would have someplace to go and they could still concentrate black students in one location.
Interesting. One more question about your presentation. We're talking about High Street. Then you said the first gay bar was Fulton, and that was...
And Division, yeah.
Was that just a coincidence? That was pretty close to High Street, wasn't it?
I don't think it was a coincidence. I don't think the city cared what happened in that area. I really don't. I think they were, because Benjamin Bossy, it's really interesting. The things that you find when you're writing a book, in his message to the city council in 1917, which was his his middle campaign, second term, his message to city council that year said, because in 1918, the city built, it's still there, it's like a little castle, I think it's apartments now, across from the McCurdy. It's a little building that looks like a little stone castle. They built a venereal disease clinic in that building. And Bossy, when he wanted to build that venereal disease clinic, he said that his administration believed that congregating vice in one area and supervising it and allowing it to flourish would keep it from spreading to decent areas. And that's why that venereal disease clinic, the city, they had a physician there, the city physician was there, and he would examine the women that worked in that red light district, give them medicine when they got diseases, and they were required every 6 months to go and get checked by this doctor that was in this venereal disease clinic. And Evansville had, we had a lot of gambling, it was wide open. That's one reason the Klan was requested to come here by Dr. William French, who was appalled by the vice, the gambling, the prostitution, all these things that were happening in Evansville, especially after Prohibition, he and several other ministers out there, they saw the Klan as the answer to vice in Evansville. That's why the Klan came here in 1921, was because they were invited here by some very conservative, religious men that were horrified by what was happening, because we had, it was common knowledge in the region that we had this this red light district that was protected by the city. Scandalous. Can you imagine that today? Oh my God. Oh, how awful.
I just wanted you to talk about the housing in your work. How much residual, if you will, is left over now from redlining?
Well, redlining was about mortgages.
Are people now free to buy where they?
Only the 1968 Fair Housing Act.
Right.
But
I'm just saying in terms of development.
well,
Tendency to still stay.
deed restrictions were legal until 1948. After 1948, especially builders at Gail Bradford and Guthrie May, builders that were building subdivisions, mainly for returning servicemen and their families out north and east. You couldn't put it in the deed that it was restricted, but what you could do is you could declare this subdivision. If you read the ads for Arcadian Acres and for Audubon Terrace and Country Club Manor and Iroquois Gardens, if you read those ads, the big bold letters is restricted subdivision. And what that told people was that blacks were not going to be able to buy houses there. It was perfectly legal to not sell a property to a black person. You just couldn't put it in the deed anymore. And so that's why that's 60-some% of African Americans still live within, a mile and a half, 2 miles of downtown, is because that's where the white people fled, as World War II ended, the white flight out there. And that's why you have a majority of African, because that's where they could afford to buy a home. So when the Fair Housing Act was passed, that became illegal. You couldn't refuse to sell a house to a black person. But by that point, very few African Americans had the affluence enough to buy a $15,000 house out in Country Club Manor, or a $12,000 house out in Iroquois Gardens, or what's the other Country Club Meadows, Country Club Manor. There was subdivisions out north, out towards Whirlpool, but all those places were all restricted until 1968. So it's how do you accumulate, because there were very few jobs open to black people. And I grew up in a time when you didn't see a black bank teller. You walked around, you never saw a black bank teller.
My dad was called to the board of realtors for selling houses to black people.
What neighborhood was it?
That would have been, I would say, between Victor Washington, Kentucky, and Governor Riverside.
Well, they were supposed to keep black people on this side of Kentucky, and later 41. But it was 68 when that became illegal. But there was in 64 was when the Fair Housing Act first, because it was the Civil Rights Act passed in 64, and then the Voting Rights Act in 65. So I guess it was 66, not 64. But so there was a movement afoot to pass a Fair Housing Act. Well, realtors around the country organized to fight that. And the leader, the one that organized the fight against fair housing in Indiana, was an Indianapolis realtor named Fred C. Tucker, which sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the local board of realtors, when they had their annual meeting in 1967, as late as that, they passed a resolution opposing what they called open housing. At that point, they called it open, not fair housing, but open housing. The board of realtors opposed that. But you had people who were called blockbusters. Blockbusters. So a realtor, after that Fair Housing Act, a realtor would find a house for sale in an all-white block, and he would go and get a black buyer for that house. And then he would go, or she, there were a few women at that time, they would go and take business cards and little cards down the block and say, this is to introduce you to your new neighbor, so-and-so, and they're black. They'd use black, Negro. And they said, so they would go down. And by the end of the month, there'd be 5 houses for sale in that, and those realtors were called blockbusters. They would go and bust that block to make money. And they would sell the one house to the black couple at an inflated price, and then sell the others to other white people at lower prices all around the block. But I can remember the first black family that moved on our street when I was probably 11 or 12. And I mean, my family was very liberal. I mean, they raised me, for God's sake. But so they didn't bother. But I knew there were people in our neighborhood that were really bothered by that.
What neighborhood were you in?
It was a subdivision out off of Morgan Avenue before you got to McDonald's Golf Course. It was, I forget the name of the subdivision. I used to know that. It was Villa. I grew up on Villa off of Morgan right there. But I remember the first black couple that moved down the block. And they didn't have any kids. Oh, they were. The odds moved, and the one I can remember, 1, 2, the house next door, the people they left, across the street left, and then one way down towards, because we were in the 13, and there was a house down there. The people were furious. This guy was furious that they bought that house. I remember my mother said, "He's an idiot." She didn't say what she thought. Well, you're an idiot. The little boy next door, we used to try and do our homework together. They were Pentecostal. And the son came over to our house to do his homework one night. And my mother, after homework, we watched Bewitched. And he went home and told his mother that we watched Bewitched. And his mother came storming through the patio door and started yelling at my mom that you've exposed my child to witchcraft and you're going to hell. And my mother said, "Well, you'll get there first if you don't walk right out that door right now. You'll get there before me if you don't leave right anyway." So if there's any book that'll get me killed, it'll be that one. So.
And it's coming out?
I haven't signed the contract yet, but I've sent them the rough manuscript for them. They're reviewing that rough manuscript, and so they'll send me what they want me to do with it.
Is it the same publisher?
Mhm.
You're going to give Professor McCall a cut and find your space?
No,
Kidding.
no. He's doing all right. He's doing all right. But I have copies. I have 5 copies. If anybody wants to buy one, I can take a credit for it. I can do all kinds of things. I'm very resourceful.
Thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it.